The History of the Chicago Seven: Film versus Real-Life Events by Marta Rodriguez. Film versus Reality. The portrayal of these 8 men in the film is not portrayed accurately. Like in all Hollywood movies, some scenes are added for suspense of the film. As I researched to learn more of this trial, there were some inconsistencies that were not portrayed in the film that I will discuss in the following slides that help me get a full scope of the trial in its entirety. The film Chicago 7 began with the speech by President Johnson advocating for the need for more troops during the Vietnam War, where he felt the need to have a monthly draft call. He wanted to increase the number of troops from 75,000 troops to 125,000. During the monthly draft call, he increased the number of young men from the ages of 18 through 24 from 17,000 to 35,000. The Chicago 7 were originally the Chicago 8. The film depicts the 8 men as completely innocent that were caught up in a political conspiracy to use them as an example as violent protesters that conspired to cause a riot across state lines. The defendants in the film claimed that their protest was a peaceful one, and the ones who incited the riots in actuality were the Chicago Police Department and not them. The judge, Julius Hoffman, was portrayed as biased as well as racist, especially against Black Panther chairman Bobby Seale. He denied Mr. Seale due process and his right to having a lawyer represent him during trial. Mr. Seale's lawyer, who was unable to represent him due to medical issues, and the judge, Hoffman, denied him in obtaining another lawyer and denied him the right to represent himself nor cross-examine any witness the prosecution had put in place to testify against them. During a moment of the film, the judge ordered the court officers to be tied and covered his mouth to keep him from disrupting the trial. In the film, they also had Fred Hampton, another member of the Black Panthers, be there as a spectator in the court that would advise Seale on what to say during his hearing. In the film, it shows how the Chicago 7 did attempt to get permits for protests and was denied. They show the protesters in the park peacefully protesting and how police officers were the ones to initiate the violence. The prosecution portrayed evidence to show that the protesters initiated the violence with the voice of Tom Hayden saying to the crowd, "Let there be blood flow in these streets," as well as had former Attorney General Ramsey Clark testified that it was a political agenda. At the end of the film, Seale part of the proceedings was dismissed because of bias from the judge, and all the other 7 defendants were found guilty. After their appeal, the decision was overturned. Reality of Chicago 7. Historically, during the moment in which the trial of the Chicago 7, who originally were called the Chicago 8, the United States was at war with Vietnam, which began in 1954. Originally, the U.S. went into war with North Vietnam, who were backed by the Soviet Union as well as China to stop the spread of communism. This war was intensified because of the ongoing Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Over 3 million people died as a result to this war. Out of 3 million people that were killed, 58,000 were U.S. soldiers, and most of the deaths were Vietnamese civilians and even women and young children. This war was a moment in history where the American people were divided. Also, during this moment in history, we had the death of Dr. Martin Luther King as well as the death of Attorney Robert F. Kennedy. The Vietnam War also divided people in the U.S. For those who were against it, they exercised the First Amendment right by peaceful protest and used violent scare tactics such as setting fire to army recruiting centers. In the summer of 1969, the defendants of the Trial 7 prepared to go to Chicago to protest the Vietnam War and the Democratic Convention. They felt that by using the moment in time, it would bring light to and publicity to their cause. The following men were the men involved in the Chicago 7 along with the groups they represented. Tom Hayden, the co-founder of the Student for Democratic Society, also known as SDS, Black Panther Chairman Bobby Seale, the only African American that was a defendant in this trial, co-founder Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin from Youth International Parties, also called Yippies, David Dillinger and Rennie Davis of the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, also known as MOB, as well as John Fornes and Lee Weiner. The 8 men were charged with federal crimes of criminal conspiracy and crossing state lines to incite a riot. In the summer of 1968, the 7 men, as well as 10,000 people, came to Chicago to peacefully protest the Vietnam War at Lincoln Park. Unfortunately, it continued to grow over several days into protests into the streets as well as demonstration at Grant Park that quickly lost control when people were confronted by Chicago police officers as well as officers from the National Guard. During August 25th through 29th, violence and rioting came into fruition as the Chicago police officers, armed with tear gas as well as batons, tried to enforce the 11 p.m. curfew in the city parks that was set by Mayor Richard Daley, who also denied permits for the protests. Many protesters were unable to abide by the curfew because either they did not have the money for the hotel or the hotel did not have the room for them because they were full because of the Democratic Convention. On August 28th, the Grant Park rally, where there were about 15,000 protesters who were present. After the rally, thousands of protesters attempted to march towards the Democratic Convention located in the International Amphitheater, but they were stopped by police officers at Conrad Hotel. Conflict and violence became a reality when police officers began to use tear gas and batons to hold back protesters. Protesters soon retaliated by throwing rocks, bricks, and bottles at police officers. Not only were protesters injured, but over 192 police officers were also injured. Soon many protesters were arrested, including the Chicago 8, soon to be Chicago 7. Bobby Seale did not take part in planning the protest. He was there as a last-minute replacement of Eldridge Cleaver to say a speech and was only in Chicago for 2 days. During the trial, Bobby Seale did not have a lawyer because his lawyer had gallbladder surgery. Bobby attempted to delay the proceedings until his lawyer was able to represent him during trial. Unfortunately, Judge Hoffman denied Bobby the right to legal representation. He even denied Bobby the right to represent himself. The movie also misrepresented the involvement of Fred Hampton. According to court transcripts and news coverage, Hampton was not involved in Bobby's trial. Judge Hoffman, however, did show bias against Bobby during the trial. On October 29th, Judge Hoffman did order court officers to bound and gag Bobby to keep him from disrupting the trial. Eventually, Bobby's case was declared a mistrial. Although Judge Hoffman sentenced him to 4 years in prison for being in contempt of court, Bobby was also found not guilty for the charges of killing a police officer in Connecticut. As Silly's case was declared a mistrial, the Chicago 8 was now the Chicago 7. The trial took place in district court on September 24th until February 18th, 1970. Judge Hoffman seemed impartial against the defendants. Hoffman would reject many pretrial motions the defense attorneys would make, but granted many of the motions presented by the prosecution. In part, some of the defendants would disrupt the proceeding as well as make mockery of the court. In the film, they presented that they had a recording of Tampani inciting the riots. This is untrue. There was no recording of the speech. Although he did say "Let there be blood" flow through the streets in the film, it is believed that it was not misconstrued the way it was portrayed in the film. When we think about our First Amendment right to freedom of speech, and it not being an absolute right, there may have been a moment that Tom Haney in part was partially responsible for including inciting some of the riot. Eventually, at the end of the trial, the Chicago Seven were acquitted for conspiracy, while 5 of the 7 were convicted of crossing state lines to incite a riot. On February 5th, they were sentenced to 5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. 2 years later, the conviction was overturned in the District Court of Appeals, which also deemed Hoffman as to be biased during the trial. All in all, do I believe that defendants were guilty? Yes, I do. I believe that the defendants, not including Seeley, and the Chicago police both had a hand in creating the riots that occurred during this moment in history. Although we shouldn't always point fingers, we should all be responsible for the actions that we commit. And I believe that some of the members of the Chicago Seven did take part in fault of the riots during this time. I would like to thank you for your time in hearing my presentation, and I hope that you've learned something just as much as I did. Thank you.